Welcome to this case study in Excel, where you have the chance to practice your skills in lots of different areas of this powerful tool. The case study consists of 7 different challenges. We look at looking up data with a few different methods, before moving on to conditional formulas and conditional formatting. From there, we'll look at the SUMPRODUCT function and a few different applications of this function, and then we'll move on to Excel tables and dynamic arrays, before finishing up with visualizing our data with Excel charts. For each of these challenges, we'll provide an overview of the instructions of the challenge, and I'll also review a correct solution to each of the tasks within the challenges as well. But please do try these tasks on your own first before looking at the review videos. Remember, you could come up with a different solution than I do, and yours could be correct as well. I'm just going to review one correct solution to these tasks. All of these topics are covered in our Fundamentals of Data Analysis in Excel course, so I do encourage you to check this course out as well. We will point to lessons that are relevant from that course for each of the challenges as we go through the case study, and we'll also provide Excel template workbooks for each of the challenges as well. I hope you enjoy the challenges because I really enjoyed pulling them together. But let's jump in and get started with our first challenge. The first challenge is all about looking up data. So why don't we jump into the workbook to review this challenge. Up here at the top, we see that the challenge is divided into 4 different tasks, and each task uses a different lookup function or combination of functions to retrieve data from our lookup table in the middle. The first task uses the VLOOKUP function, a very popular function, to populate the city column of this first source table, our static table. The second task uses a combination of the index and match functions to retrieve a value for the shipment type. So for the first 2 columns in our static source table, we need to retrieve data from our lookup table. Then we move on to our dynamic lookup table, and this is going to be a little bit more challenging. So for our task number 3, we're using a combination of VLOOKUP and HLOOKUP to dynamically retrieve data from our lookup table onto this dynamic source table. And for task 4, we're using a combination of index and match once again, but this time to dynamically return information for this 4th column. So what does that look like? Well, if I go to the Solution tab in our workbook, and I navigate over to our dynamic source table, you'll see the 2 column headers that we need to fill in our dynamic source table have a drop down in the header. So right now it's populated with city, but I can also select shipment type and budget. And we can see that the solution we've entered into these columns is able to go through and retrieve different values based on the selection of the column header. So this is why this task, or these 2 tasks, are a little bit more challenging. Let's start reviewing some solutions to our looking up data tasks. Now, remember, I'm going to demonstrate one possible solution to each of the tasks, but there may be other correct answers that you come up with that still retrieve the correct values. So let's start with task number 1. This is where I had to use the VLOOKUP function to populate this city column. And so I know that with the VLOOKUP function, I need to define a few things. I need to define the value that I want to look up, which will be our category column. I need to define an array or table of data where I want to retrieve the lookup value from, which will be the lookup table here. I'll come back to this in a second. And then I also need to define which column from our lookup table I want to use to populate this city column. So in our case, it's going to be city here. So before I start actually coding and defining our VLOOKUP function, one thing I can do to make our function easier to write as well as read afterwards is use our name manager to define this specific area in our lookup table. This is all the data that I want to use to match to our category column from our static source table. And then these are all the rows of data that are relevant for the possible lookup values to return into these columns. So I'm just going to highlight this area. And in the top left-hand corner, I'm going to call this lookup data. And now we can refer to this in our functions, and it's just going to make it a little bit easier to work with. So let's start typing in our VLOOKUP function. So our lookup value is just the value of that row in our category column. Our table array is going to be that lookup data, which now appears in the IntelliSense since we defined it. And then the column index number that I want to return is city. So that's column number 1, number 2, like that. And we see that we retrieve London for category A. If I take a quick look at our table, we see that that's correct. So now I can simply drag this down, and if you get the correct answer, all of the cells are going to highlight green, so this looks good. If I just click into the bottom cell here, we see we're looking up the value of C23 in our lookup data, retrieving the second column, which is our city. Let's start to review a solution to task number 2, which is using the index and the match functions together to retrieve the shipment type value from our lookup table to fill in this second column on our static source table. So how we use index and match functions together is the match function can be used as an argument within our index function. But before we do that, I'm going to use the two separately so we can see exactly how this works. I'm going to use the index function. The first thing we need to define is the array or the table of where we want to actually retrieve a value from. So this is going to be our lookup data. And then on this array, we need to define a row number of where we want to retrieve the value. So from our source table, we see that the corresponding category for this row is A, and category A is in the first row of our lookup table. So I'm going to use a 1 for that. Then an optional argument is the column number. So since we want shipment type, this is going to be column 3 from our lookup table. And when I do that, we see that we've hard-coded the value, but it does return the correct answer. When we look at row 1 and column 3 from our lookup table, we are retrieving the correct shipment type that corresponds to the category of our lookup table. But since we hard-coded it, if I were to drag this function, this formula, down all the rows, some of them are correct, but some of them aren't. So we need to make this to be dynamic, or dynamic in the sense of retrieving the correct row. And this is where the match function can come in. So let's just undo that for now. So we've hard-coded this value of 1, and we've hard-coded the value of 3. So hard-coding the column number is okay, because we're always going to return the shipment type. This is a static lookup. But what's going to change is the row number. So this is where we want to use the match function. So let's just do that on the column over to the right here. So when we use the match function, we need to define the lookup value, which is our category. We need to define our lookup array. And in this case, it's not our entire lookup data. It's actually just going to be the 3 values of the category. So we're just going to do this. And then we need to define what match type. It's an exact match. So we'll do 0. I noticed that when we use this, we retrieve a value of 1. And this is what we can use to replace this hard-coded value of 1 in our index formula. So once again, just to make our function a little bit easier to read and write, let's just define these values, and let's call this lookup categories. And now that we've done that, let's update our index function. So let's replace this value of 1 with a match function. The lookup value is going to be our category from our source table, rather. Where we want to look up this value is in our lookup categories, and I want an exact match. And I'll close that bracket. And now when I do that, we still retrieve the same value of air, but when I copy that down, we get the right answer for every row in our static source table. Our third task is where we move from a static lookup to a dynamic lookup of data. And the dynamic part comes from the column header. We see that in our dynamic source table, which we're using for tasks 3 and 4, these columns have a drop down within the column header. And so we have the ability to choose different options from our lookup table to fill in the values of the column. And so the data that we want to bring in has to correspond to that selected value. And this is where the dynamic part comes in. If we look at the instructions for task number 3, we see that we need to use our VLOOKUP function, which we used earlier, with an HLOOKUP function. So this is a little bit of a hint that it's the HLOOKUP that's going to make this dynamic. If we look at our original VLOOKUP function, we see that we're looking up our category column on our lookup data over here, and we just hard-coded the value of 2 because we want to return the second column from this lookup data. And this is the part that we need to update with HLOOKUP. Instead of a hard-coded value of 2, we need to create a dynamic way to retrieve a value of the column we want to return. And we see that this is what we have in the index, the first row of our lookup table. So before we go and we define our function, let's go and just name a few things like we did earlier that will make our formulas a little bit easier to read. I'm going to select the the column headers in our lookup table and just the first row. And we're going to call this lookup index. And it'll be a little bit clearer exactly what this does in just a second. And then I'm also going to select the entire lookup table, so the column headers all the way down to select all the data this time. And we're going to call this lookup table. Okay, so before we start with our VLOOKUP function, let's just see how we're going to use the HLOOKUP function to retrieve these index values. So I'm just going to do this off to the side here. I'm going to start with HLOOKUP. And HLOOKUP really is just the same as VLOOKUP. It's just flipped 90 degrees. Instead of doing a vertical lookup, we're doing a horizontal lookup. So the value that we want to look up is our column header. And I'm going to be sure to anchor that by hitting the F4 key. And now where I want to look up this column header value is in our lookup index. So we're looking for the value of our column in the lookup index. The row that we want to retrieve is the second row, the value of the matching second row. And we want an exact match. So now we see right now we have a value of 2 because we've selected city. If we look to our lookup table, we see city, a value of 2. From the dropdown, if I select shipment type, that value changes to 3. That corresponds to the index there. So let's change this back. I'm just going to copy this formula. And I'm going to use that in our VLOOKUP function. So VLOOKUP, the value we want to look up is category. This time we actually want to look at the entire lookup table. So I'm going to say lookup table as the array where we want to look up our value. And this is where I can paste in that HLOOKUP function. And this is the dynamic part. This is really where the magic happens. This is where we get that index value changing based on the selection in our column header. So I'm just going to paste that in because we've defined it before. And then I just need to finish our VLOOKUP formula with an exact match. Close the bracket, commit that. And we see that we're retrieving the correct value in the first row. Let's just copy that down. We get all correct values. And now let's test this with shipment type. We see our index over here changes, but all our values update correctly as well. And budget, so we're good to go. Let's move this back to city, and we've successfully completed the third task. For task number 4, we have to once again use dynamic lookup, retrieving values from our lookup table based on the selection from the dropdown in a column header. So let's leave this on shipment type for now and have a look at the instructions. So we want to use the index and match functions to populate this 4th column of the dynamic source table. So we used index and match earlier for the second column for shipment type, and let's have a look at what we did. So we used the index function as our outer function in our formula, and we were looking in our lookup data in the middle here. And then we used the match function as our second argument in index, and we matched the category, the value of a category for a specific row in this lookup categories, and we did an exact match. So this is how we selected the row within the data, so we knew what to retrieve. And then for the third argument in the index function, we hard-coded a value of 3, and that's because we always wanted to return the shipment type. So really, this is all dynamic up until this last hard-coded value, and that's what we want to update to have a truly dynamic solution for this 4th column. So we can actually just click on this cell, copy the formula, and paste it in our new table, because we're still referring to our category column, this time in our dynamic source table, and everything that we reference, because we've named it, copies over nicely. So that's another good advantage of naming certain aspects within our lookup table for our formulas. When we copy them over, we're still referring to the same thing. And in fact, before I update that hard-coded argument, I'm going to want to name one more thing in our lookup table. Just these names of our column headers, I'm going to name lookup columns. Just like that. Okay, so now let's start updating this third argument. I'm going to use the match function again. And really what we want to do is do the same thing that we see to the argument to the left, but this time just for the column header. So the value that I want to match is our column header. So I'm going to make sure to anchor that. And then where I want to look for our column header is in our lookup columns. And I want an exact match. So now I just need to close the brackets and copy this formula down. And now when I select city, we see that all the values update properly. We're getting matching values to the column beside it, which is great. Shipment type, we see that all those are correct, and budget as well. So we just updated our existing index and match formula, this time to make sure both the rows and the columns are dynamic and can respond to different values in our column header.
Continue learning. Join CFI today.